Well, welcome to the beginning of our 2024-2025 online lecture series. I'm Aaron Brody. I'm the director of the Bade Museum, which is one of the co-sponsors of this two-semester-long talk series, together with folks at the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley. So I'd just like to send out a hello and a welcome to all of you who are live today on YouTube. And I will yield the floor to Dr. Melissa Craddock, who will read our land acknowledgement.
Thank you. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders and their ancestors. We're living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past and present. As a museum dedicated to advancing knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant, the Bade Museum welcomes scholarly discussions across boundaries of nationality, religion, gender, and other aspects of identity. We particularly welcome scholars who are engaging with risky topics in today's fraught political landscape, and whose scholarship bridges past and present through study of issues like migration, borderlands, and social boundaries. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And it's also my distinct pleasure to introduce Pacific School of Religion's president, David Vasquez Levy, who will be giving a brief comment now on the series. Please, David.
Thank you, Aaron, and welcome everyone. It is good to be with you this morning. My name is David Vasquez Levy. I have the privilege of serving as president here at PSR, which is the institution where the Bade Museum is housed. Collection is a critically important element of our work together here and as a community. In Dr. Brody's words, it is the religion of the 99% that we get to study in a collection that's mostly made up of people's daily life, and the critical importance of excavating and understanding the history and the complex history of individuals in their lived experience in ways that only a material record can invite us to do, in challenging sometimes the narratives that we tell ourselves. However, narratives matter, so we're grateful today to Dr. Demetriou, who will invite us into this initial conversation as we engage this year on this critical and important discussion about migration and mobility. We are living through a time where the largest number of people are on the move in the history of the world, forced to migrate by conflict, by changing environmental realities, but also by opportunities and an increased globalization of our society. The challenges we face and the reason that this is a critical importance to Pacific School of Religion, whose commitment it is to prepare spiritually rooted leaders to create a world where all can thrive, is the fact that most of the mobility that we are experiencing comes at a high cost to those who are most marginalized, to those who are part of the 99%. While many of us have the ability to move globally with ease because of technology developments, transportation, and our legal rights, for the vast majority of people in the world, particularly the desperately poor, the opportunity to move is limited. It is therefore important that as we engage in these contemporary issues, that we do so with an eye to the past, to understand that the history of mobility and migration is not just something that's happening today for one particular political reason or another, but that it is part of the human experience. It has always been, and that both our religious and sacred texts and our traditions can inform the ways we engage and how we narrate and understand the need for mobility and the opportunities that we have. So thank you for being part of this conversation with us.
Thank you so much, President David, for setting the scene. I really appreciate that. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Denise Demetriou is professor and Jerry and Jeannie Ranglis Chair in Ancient Greek History at the University of California in San Diego. She is author of a brand new book, Phoenicians among Others, Why Migrants Mattered in the Ancient Mediterranean, published by Oxford Press just in 2023, and also Negotiating Identity in the Ancient Mediterranean, published by Cambridge Press in 2012. At UC San Diego, she also serves as the director of the Center for Hellenic Studies. So it's a distinct pleasure to have Dr. Demetriou kick off our lecture series today. Denise, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today about Phoenician migrants. So I'm going to share my screen and talk about the Phoenicians, the famed seafarers of the ancient Mediterranean, right? Who were one of the ancient Near Eastern populations that basically regularly migrated throughout the first millennium BCE. They were organized into powerful and wealthy independent city-states, like the ones that you see here in the green area of the map, like Tyre and Sidon, Arados, Byblos, and other sites in the Levantine coast. But one of the things that's interesting about them is that from the very first moment that we hear about the Phoenicians in the historical and archaeological sources in the early Iron Age, just at the turn of the millennium, the first millennium BCE, the Phoenicians were on the move. We know that Phoenician merchants and craftsmen and settlers migrated from their home states, first to Cyprus, where they established several urban centers, but the most famous of which is Kition, which you can see on this map. And then their migration continued into the 8th century BCE, and they founded settlements in the various areas that are colored in like light purple, appropriately, sort of, on this map, especially in Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, the coast of North Africa, Iberia, the Balearic Islands. But in this same period, in addition to founding new settlements, they also started to settle as immigrants in Egypt and in Greek communities around the Aegean Circle, in Carthage, and also in other areas in the Mediterranean. So by the 7th century BCE, they had created an extensive network, trade network, that spanned the whole of the Mediterranean region from Assyria to Iberia, as a famous exhibit at the Met almost 10 years ago now also said. The thing that interests me about this is that this Phoenician mobility and migration permanently transformed both the people, the individuals who migrated, and also the societies that they encountered. And that's what I would like to talk about today. And I will do that by sharing some examples with you of Phoenician immigrants who were living in Athens, in Carthage, and in Egypt from the 4th century to the 1st century BCE. And my goal is to listen to what the Phoenician immigrants themselves have to tell us. What do they tell us about their experiences? How did they change? Did their identities change? How did they what was their relationship like with their host state? How did their presence change their host state? And the central question that motivates my talk and my research is, what were the effects of migration in the 4th century BCE, and why did migrants matter, and how? And I'm going to begin with the story of one famous Phoenician immigrant, that of Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, who emigrated, lived, and died in Athens. And I would like to use his story to demonstrate something that our sources don't often reveal to us, and that is the precarity of the life of an immigrant, anxiety regarding one's status and one's identity, and the hostility and stereotyping that immigrants experienced. And then for most of the talk, I will focus on some inscriptions, texts inscribed on stone, most of them bilingual in Greek and Phoenician, or in Phoenician and Egyptian, to show how Phoenician immigrants negotiated their presence in Athens, Carthage, and Egypt, and also to show how they changed these states. The first example I would like to share is the story of Zeno, the founder of the philosophical school of Stoicism, which is widely recognized today as one of the major contributions of the ancient Greeks. But Zeno was actually not a Greek. He was actually a Phoenician immigrant from Kition, a mixed Phoenician and Greek settlement on the island of Cyprus. And his arrival in Athens sometime in the 4th century BCE is a good story as it's described in our sources. Who knows if it's true, but if that's how it happened, but it's a good story. It turns out that Zeno was shipwrecked on his way to Athens on a Phoenician ship that was carrying the quintessential Phoenician product of purple dye. And the first thing that Zeno did when he arrived after being shipwrecked in Athens was actually to go to a bookstore, because isn't that what we would all do if we were in that situation? And he picked up a book, and the book was about the philosopher Socrates. Zeno read it and then told the bookseller that he wanted to find a teacher like Socrates. And lo and behold, as it so happened, another philosopher happened to be walking by, and the bookseller told him, here you go, you can study with this man whose name was Crates. And of course, the rest is history, because Zeno subsequently established his own school in the very heart of Athens, in a stoa, right, or a portico in the marketplace. And Stoicism flourished among the Romans, winning over emperors such as Marcus Aurelius. And it's also extremely popular today. There is such a thing as Stoic Week, which happens next month. October 28th is the beginning. I just looked it up this morning, but it happens every year. It's been happening for 11 years, I think. And there are also gurus that talk to tech companies like Google about Stoicism, to try and increase their profitability. So my point is that were it not for mobility and migration, Stoicism might not have developed into one of the most influential schools, philosophical schools of antiquity. Zeno was obviously upwardly socially mobile, and many immigrants were, but they also faced a lot of prejudice and discrimination. Ancient sources, for example, describe Zeno's Phoenician ethnicity as being an undesirable trait, and his foreignness too. Even his teacher called him Little Phoenician, which is a demeaning term of endearment. Diogenes Laertius, who is a Greek biographer of ancient philosophers, described Zeno as being a stingy foreigner, or stingy because he was a foreigner. And he was also accused of plagiarism by a rival philosopher who basically accused Zeno of stealing his ideas and dressing them in Phoenician style. And even after his death, one of his students composed an epigram in his honor, and he tried to downplay in this epigram Zeno's Phoenician origin. And you can see it on this slide. And it says, it ended with the lines that you see here. What reproach is there if your fatherland is Phoenicia? Did not Cadmus also come from there, from whom Hellas has writing? So Zeno's foreign origins from a predominantly Phoenician city-state were a handicap for him. This brief story of Zeno, I think, is extremely valuable for us because it adds to our understanding that immigrants had this sense of otherness imposed on them by their host communities. And it also shows us that even in the face of discrimination, they profoundly shaped the societies in which they lived. But it's difficult to discern what it was like to be an immigrant because we usually study sources that are produced by the state or by members of the host state. Texts, though, that are inscribed on stone, such as the ones that you see here, actually record the voices of the immigrants, the Phoenician immigrants themselves, and so they offer us a different viewpoint. These texts that you see on this slide are mostly bilingual texts in Greek and Phoenician or Egyptian and Phoenician. They're inscribed on private tombstones or religious dedications, or they are administrative documents. And scholars, for the most part, used to treat these texts as curiosities for their linguistic and philological value. But I think that what they also do is these texts is that they reveal the social world of immigrants. And when we read these texts, we realize that immigrants faced similar issues that continue to challenge immigrants and states today. How to adapt and feel a sense of belonging, how to construct a new identity, and how to promote or manage migration from the perspective of the state. Just as immigrants today, the Phoenicians that I study developed a variety of strategies to adapt to migration. One of the most common adaptive practices among immigrants was name changing, and specifically among Phoenician immigrants was name changing, which of course has long been a familiar practice among immigrants, even in modern history. We can think about all the stories of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island and either declaring English-sounding names or officials giving them ones. Many Phoenician immigrants in ancient Greek communities seem to have done exactly the same thing, and they changed their names in one of three ways. They either translated their name into a Greek one, they adopted a completely unrelated Greek name, or they modified their Phoenician name by Hellenizing it, either in spelling or in grammar. And I'd like to illustrate this name-changing practice using this 4th century BCE tombstone of a Phoenician immigrant in Athens. When this man died, his burial plot was marked with a tombstone, and you can see it on the left here, that was shaped like the facade of a Greek temple with this triangular pediment on top. Below the pediment is a funerary epitaph, which you can see more clearly in the zoomed version of this photo. And underneath the epitaph is an image, underneath which is a longer poem. The epitaph is written twice, once in Greek and once in Phoenician. And when we compare the Greek and the Phoenician texts, we see that the commissioner, Dom Selech, Hellenized his name. He added a Greek masculine ending and made it into Domsalos. The deceased, Shem, chose a completely unrelated Greek name to his Phoenician name and became Antipatros. And his father's name, Abdashtart, which means servant of Astarte, was translated into Aphrodisios. Astarte was a Phoenician goddess, and both Greeks and Phoenicians usually identified her with the Greek Aphrodite. So Aphrodisios is a perfect translation of Abdashtart. And by changing their names, Phoenician immigrants changed the way that they identified themselves, perhaps to fit in. So we can ask whether name changing was a voluntary behavior, because it's also doubtful that Phoenicians in Athens or elsewhere in the Greek world would be able to pass as Greeks. In fact, the very opposite, as we saw in the case of Zeno, who was subjected to disparaging comments because he was a foreigner and because he was a Phoenician. But name changing might have boosted their status, might have established some basis of trust that facilitated their presence and their work in Greek-speaking cities, in this case, Athens. And perhaps it also encouraged a sense of belonging. But what's interesting is that this practice never erased Phoenicians' civic or linguistic identities, because they always provided their state of origin. Antipatros tells us he was from Ashkelon. Dom Selech tells us that he's from Sidon, and they use the Phoenician script and alphabet and language to to declare these identities on their tombstones and other types of inscriptions. So by changing their names, they certainly were not trying to hide their foreign origins. This practice of sort of merging Greek and Phoenician elements in funerary customs is also visible on the image on this tombstone. The image depicts a dead body lying on a bed, the prow of a ship visible emerging in the background of this image, a lion that sort of seems to be menacingly hovering over the dead body, and then another man who is stretching over the dead body as though perhaps to protect it. Some of the elements on this image are relatively common in classical Athenian funerary art, like the ship, for example, or the lion. And as my host today, Aaron, also has shown, ships are also visible on Phoenician tombstones as well. But other elements on here, such as the dead body, are highly unusual in Greek art. And so we have here this combination of both familiar and unfamiliar elements that result in an image that is difficult to comprehend. Modern scholars have tried to understand it either as an allegory or in symbolic terms, but I think that it would have been difficult for a Greek to understand, but it also might have been difficult for a Phoenician to understand, given the Greek form of the monument and the Greek artistic style that we see here. And the same can be said about the epigram that is written in Greek underneath this image. The form of the text is Greek, but the content is not, and it's not written in grammatically correct Greek. The grammar is a little off. And the poem begins by saying, "Let no one wonder what this image is really about." So it tries to explain the image, but it doesn't really help very much because the image still remains mysterious, both to us, but perhaps also to an ancient audience as well, given this mixture of elements that I described. But Phoenician immigrants in Athens were comfortable operating in this space that existed between their two worlds. And their cultural references may not have made sense to the Greeks who were looking at this tombstone and reading the texts, but they still gestured an inclusion in Athenian society. This monument is not unique. There are many other examples like it from the Greek world. And I think this type of monument in general demonstrates how individuals who moved and migrated transformed the ancient Mediterranean world. Migration resulted in changing modes of identification, the production of these bicultural monuments, such as the one that you see here, and also the introduction of new languages and new gods in host societies. If we now turn to Carthage, we see that the adaptive strategies of Eastern Phoenicians follow the same patterns as in the Greek world, meaning that they adopted cultural practices of their host state and became more integrated, but at the same time, they maintained distinct immigrant identities. Carthage was one of the most important trading centers in the ancient Mediterranean and one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities at that time, especially in the 4th century BCE. Carthage was founded sometime in the late 9th or early 8th century BCE by Phoenicians from Tyre. And in the 4th century, Carthage attempted to solidify control of areas in the central Mediterranean, like Malta and Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily. And it tried to do so by appealing to their common ancestry from Tyre. This special relationship between Carthage and Tyre provided a different set of circumstances from those that Phoenician immigrants encountered in Greek city-states, including and this is important, including that they spoke the same language. Right? The Western Phoenicians spoke a dialect, but they spoke the same language. And so Eastern Phoenician immigrants in Carthage declare their city-state of origin on their funerary stones and their religious offerings, as they do in the examples that we saw from Athens, for instance. But at the same time, they also adopted Carthaginian religious practices, such as giving vows in the sanctuary of the goddess Tanit and the god Baal Hamon. This was the most popular and famous Carthaginian cult place, infamous today, I would say, because this was where child sacrifice was practiced. The cult of Tanit and Baal Hamon offered a way for the whole resident population of Carthage to come together as a civic body and participate in local rituals, whether they were citizens, immigrants, freedmen, or enslaved persons. And we have evidence from this sanctuary that Greeks and Egyptians, Libyans, other foreigners, and Eastern Phoenician immigrants used this sanctuary. We have first-generation Sidonian immigrant women and Sidonian freedmen recording their vows on stelae that they set up in this sanctuary. And from the 4th century BCE to the 2nd century BCE, among the dedicators were members of families who constructed their identity by claiming descent from an original ancestor who had migrated to Carthage from Tyre. And I'll share one example with you. Here's one example to Lady Tanit, the face of Baal, and the Lord Baal Hamon, to whom, and then this is a name that we haven't reconstructed fully yet, but this woman made a vow. She's the daughter of Baal-Liaton, the son of the city of Tyre. So in this case, Baal-Liaton would have been the individual who had migrated to Carthage from Tyre. And the dedicants in these texts trace their genealogy, and sometimes they will offer very long genealogies of 4 or 5 generations. And they trace their genealogy back to an ancestor who had been a citizen of Tyre as a matter of pride and a marker of their family's immigrant origins from Carthage's mother city. So in the 4th to the 2nd centuries BCE, when Carthage mobilized its Tyrian roots as a tool of empire, perhaps it became prestigious to be descended from an immigrant from Tyre. But at the same time, the cult of Tanit and Baal Hamon, open to all genders, social strata, immigrants, citizens, offered an opportunity for integration to all Carthaginian residents. So in Carthage, the different social, cultural, historical context resulted in some variation in the adaptive practices and identities of Phoenician immigrants from those that we saw in the Greek world. And the same holds true in Egypt. And in Egypt, interactions between Egyptians and Phoenicians had been ongoing for many centuries. Phoenicians served as mercenaries in the armies of Psammetichos I in the 7th century BCE, and they were later settled in their own quarter in Memphis. They served in the armies of pharaohs who campaigned in Nubia in the 6th century BCE. And they even marked their presence there by scratching graffiti, you know, Kilroy was here, on the colossal statue of Ramses II in Abu Simbel. They were present as traders in the Eastern Nile Delta. They lived as soldiers and traders in the famous fortress of Elephantine in the 5th century BCE. We have Phoenician graffiti from the 5th to the 3rd centuries BCE scratched on the walls of the mortuary temple of the New Kingdom Egyptian pharaoh Sethis I. This is early 13th century BCE, but in the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE it became a pilgrimage site. And so Phoenician and Greek and Carian and other pilgrims or soldiers, some of whom lived in Egyptian cities like Heliopolis or Memphis, told us that they were there by scratching their graffiti on the walls of this temple. And as a final example, but this list that I'm giving you is not exhaustive, We have a mid-3rd century BCE letter that I'll show you later, recorded on papyrus that was sent from the priests of the Temple of Astarte in Memphis that suggests that Phoenicians were still living in Memphis in this period. The Egyptian state responded to the presence of immigrants by separating foreign populations from each other and from Egyptians. For example, we know that Egyptian soldiers served in different contingents from foreign speakers. All foreign trade was directed to a single port, separating foreign from local traders. And foreign populations were settled in separate quarters in cities according to their ethnicities. The control that the Egyptian state exercised over where foreigners settled and how they interacted with Egyptian authorities led to differences in how migrants, including Phoenicians, identified themselves. And it also led to the transformation of the Phoenicians' cultural practices and to the introduction of new customs in Egyptian society. One of the most drastic changes among Phoenician immigrants in Egypt is how they changed their main mode of identification. Usually, Phoenician immigrants living in places other than Egypt identified themselves in terms of their city-state. We saw this when we saw Antipatros or Shem identify as being from Ashkelon and Domsele from Sidon. Zeno insisted that he was from Kition and that this identification was inscribed on a dedication of a stoa that he gave at some point during his life. But in Egypt, this doesn't happen very much. Phoenician immigrants did not usually give their city-state of origin, with very few exceptions. Instead, in Memphis, where the Egyptian authorities had segregated foreigners into different quarters according to their ethnicity. So there was a Greek quarter and a Carian quarter and a Syrian quarter and a Phoenician one as well. The Phoenicians started to identify themselves as Phoenicians. The Phoenician quarter in Memphis was centered around a temple dedicated to the goddess Astarte. And the priests of this temple sent a letter to the local Egyptian authorities sometime in the middle of the 3rd century BCE, asking to be given the same price when buying oil as the Carians and the Greeks in Memphis. And the priests identify the temple as belonging to the Phoenico-Aiguptioi, the Phoenico-Egyptians in Memphis, which is a new designation, and it's a designation that suggests that Phoenician immigrants living in Memphis had adopted this hybrid identity that valued equally their immigrant origins and their current home as well. One stele from Memphis, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, illustrates several other ways in which Phoenicians adapted to being immigrants in Egypt. The stele dates from the 2nd or 1st centuries BCE, and it bears a representation of the god Horus standing on crocodiles and holding snakes and other animals. And it is inscribed with hieroglyphic texts that record magical incantations for healing purposes. And the stele stands on a base that bears 4 lines of a dedicatory text in Phoenician, using the Phoenician language and script, that appeals to both Egyptian and Phoenician gods to protect the dedicant, his 4 sons, and their mother. And you can see the text of this dedication on the slide. The Phoenician text follows Phoenician customs, such as providing a long genealogy of ancestors and naming Phoenician gods like Astarte. But it also demonstrates several adaptive strategies, some of which we have encountered before. First, name changing. One of the dedicant's sons is called Abdosir. This is not a translation into an Egyptian name, an adoption of an Egyptian name or an Egyptianized form of a Phoenician name. It was a Phoenician name that incorporated the name of an Egyptian god, Osiris, and it meant servant of Osiris. So we still see name changing, but it just takes a different form than what we saw in Athens. Second, Ashtar's dedication to the glorious goddess Isis, the goddess Astarte, and the gods suggests that Phoenician migrants both adopted the worship of Egyptian religion, but also that they may have introduced Phoenician gods to Egypt. I'll give you another example here with this 6th century papyrus written in Phoenician that was sent by an Egyptian businesswoman in Tel Defne, which was an Egyptian town, to a Phoenician woman in Memphis. And it seems from the rest of the letter, I've only given you the beginning, the very beginning of the letter here, but the rest of the letter suggests that these women were operating a banking business. And when we look at this, the beginning of this text, at least, we can see that it provides more evidence that Phoenician gods were introduced and worshipped in Egypt. The letter begins with this blessing by the Phoenician god Baal Saphon, the most prominent divinity in Tel Defne, even though it was an Egyptian town, alongside blessings from all the gods, presumably Egyptian gods, who were worshipped there. The ability to group Egyptian and Phoenician deities together, just as Ashtar did when he dedicated his stele both to the Egyptian Isis and the Phoenician Astarte, was a result of mobility and migration. Egyptians and Phoenicians adopted each other's gods, almost creating a kind of a new religious system. And Phoenician immigrants did not only adopt Egyptian gods, they also translated Egyptian religious language into Phoenician. And we can see this in Ashtar's dedication, right? Ashtar, can go back here, ended his dedication by asking Isis, Astarte, and the gods to give favor and life to his wife and sons. This expression, to give life or give favor, also appears in other dedications by Phoenicians in Egypt, but it's actually Egyptian religious language, not originally Phoenician. We can see this adoption of Egyptian language, religious language, translated into Phoenician on these two figurines of Harpocrates, both of which bear a Phoenician inscription on the base of the statuette that begins with, "May Harpocrates give life to," and then it tells us who the recipients should be. And the same phrase occurs also on a bilingual Phoenician and Egyptian text inscribed on a 4th century BCE bronze figurine of the deified scribe Imhotep, probably originating from Memphis, but it was actually discovered in the Phoenician homeland. And if we read the two texts, the Phoenician and the Egyptian, that are inscribed on this figurine together, we read, "Imhotep, son of Ptah, may he give life," in Egyptian, "to Wahipre, son of Eshmuniaton," and then this part was in Phoenician. These examples suggest that Phoenicians adopted not only Egyptian gods as their own, such as Isis, Harpocrates, or the deified Imhotep, but also Egyptian religious customs, which they even exported back to their home states. This adoption of Egyptian gods by Phoenician immigrants then did not remain local in Egypt. In Egypt, the Phoenician immigrants frequently translated the Egyptian Isis into the Phoenicians' Astarte. And we saw that in the dedication of Ashtar when he appeals to the mistress, the glorious goddess Isis and the goddess Astarte. Another example of this identification of Isis with Astarte is a stone figurine, probably from Memphis, of Isis holding the child god Horus, and it's inscribed with a Phoenician dedication by a man called Gersaphon, and he dedicates this to Astarte. This association between Isis and Astarte did not remain isolated in Egypt. The Phoenicians' mobility helped transfer this new variation of this goddess to other places as well. For example, in the late 2nd century BCE, 130 to 129 BCE, a Phoenician from Sidon gave a dedication in Greek to Isis, the mother of the gods Astarte, on the Greek island of Delos. Delos was a major international sanctuary in this period and a duty-free center from the 2nd century BCE onward. So it may have been among Phoenician immigrants in Egypt that this deity, who could be worshipped with different names, emerged, but the Phoenicians brought her to Greek communities. And once she arrived on Greek communities, Isis Astarte accumulated another name as well, that of Aphrodite. And we have an example that I also include here, another dedication that is to Isis, Sotera, which means savior, Astarte, Aphrodite, Euploia, which means smooth sailing. And so this time, this combination of this goddess who can have all these different names that come from different traditions and different ethnicities is honored because of her role as a guarantor of safe sailing. And this is an attribute that all three of them, Isis, Aphrodite, and Astarte, shared. The Phoenicians had access to a larger pool of religious language and gods because of their vast networks and their interactions with both Egyptians and Greeks, and of course, many other peoples as well. The practices of individual Phoenicians who gave multiple names to divinities that came from different traditions helped create new divine entities that were in a way common to all. And in creating these connections, the Phoenicians inched, I think, toward creating a common Mediterranean religion. A 1st century BCE hymn to Isis that identifies Isis with the goddesses of many other cultures kind of demonstrates this. The hymn was inscribed in Greek on the columns of the entrance of a temple at Medinet Madi in the southwestern Fayum in the Nile Delta. And the hymn praises Isis for all that she does as a founder of life, a guarantor of laws and customs, a grantor of bountiful harvests, the hymn says at some point. And then it declares that all Mediterranean populations have a name for her. And it says this: as many mortals live upon the infinite land, Thracians and Greeks, and as many barbarians there are, they all call in their own voices, in their own countries, your beautiful name, much honored by all. The Syrians call you Astarte, Artemis, Nanaya. The nations of the Lycians call you Queen Leto. The Thracian men call you Mother of the Gods. The Greeks, the great throned Hera, sweet Aphrodite, good Hestia, and Rhea and Demeter. And the Egyptians Theui, because you alone are all the other goddesses the nations invoke. So although the hymn ostensibly honors the Egyptian Isis, the implication is that whenever any group worshiped their own goddess or goddesses, they also implicitly worshipped Isis, suggesting that this goddess had become part of a common Mediterranean religion. And these types of religious innovations would not have taken place had it not been for Phoenician immigrants in Egypt, who first equated Isis with Astarte. So I would like to just draw some conclusions and put this, what I've said, sort of together to show how migration changed both host states and immigrants, why migrants mattered, and of course, why Phoenician migrants mattered in particular. First of all, migration led to the construction of new immigrant identities. Phoenician immigrants continued to use their language in the Greek world and in Egypt as, I suggest, an expression of an immigrant identity. And they even came to espouse a hybrid Phoenician-Egyptian identity in Egypt. And in Carthage, being a descendant of an immigrant family from Tyre was a mark of pride. Second, Phoenician immigrants in the Greek world and in North Africa adopted similar practices to adapt to migration and became members and created a sense of belonging in the states that they lived in. Name changing, for example, the adoption of local artistic styles, the adoption of local gods and local cult practices, all of these facilitated their inclusion and social advancement in their host societies. Over time, tombstones or dedications like the ones that we have seen today in foreign alphabets, temples that were dedicated to Phoenician gods, names that sounded Greek or Egyptian but were actually Phoenician. All of this became part of the social fabric of Greek and Egyptian societies, and it changed the way that they looked and that they sounded. The high mobility of the Phoenicians also meant that religious innovation, social conventions, and linguistic practices were transferable, right? They didn't stay in one place, but rather the worship of Egyptian gods traveled with the Phoenicians, and the creation of new gods with multiple names traveled from Egypt to Greece and back. And what happened in each of these places was not locally or regionally isolated. It actually rippled across the Mediterranean basin. And I think that ultimately case studies like the one of Phoenician immigrants show that migration transformed what were multi-ethnic societies to cosmopolitan societies. It resulted in states whose civic bodies were made up of a diverse population that had different religions and spoke different languages and had different institutions. But at the end, immigrants and citizens alike were integral members who contributed to, maintained, and belonged to the societies of their new homes. And I will thank you and stop there, and I'm happy to take questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen for now.
Thank you, Denise, for such a fascinating lecture. I think you really gave us entree to this multicultural world of the past in the Mediterranean. There are a few questions that are coming in, so I'll get things started here. One of them says, throughout this talk, you use the term host state to refer to the new areas in which migrants of Phoenician origin settled. Could you explain your usage of this term? Were the host states hostile to their new migrant populations? Did they put regulations in place to limit immigration?
Yes, sometimes they so I use the term host state to indicate a polity in which migrants lived. So it's not the home state of the migrants, but it's the host state. It's the state that is, let's say, hosting them, in quotation marks. Yes, all states had what in some literature is known as a migration and a member regime, which really is talking about the different laws. It refers to the different laws that each state might have had to regulate immigration, meaning both promoting and limiting, and also assigning specific social statuses to immigrants, restrictions that they might have had. For example, in the Greek world, migrants could not own property, could not vote. They didn't have some citizen rights or most citizen rights. This is just to give you an example of the different laws and regulations. But they also had perhaps strategies to attract immigrants. They especially liked immigrants who were wealthy. So we can also start to see the inequalities that existed among migrant populations. So wealthy immigrants were always more welcome in their host states, than other immigrants who were poorer or might have been enslaved or were not as successful as some of the people that we hear about in our sources. So migration and membership regimes also includes not just these legal aspects that I just talked about, but it also includes cultural perceptions of immigrants. So stereotyping, different kinds of negative attitudes or positive attitudes sometimes associated with specific immigrant groups. So all of that we do have evidence from antiquity. In Egypt, as I said, their migration and membership regime was to segregate immigrants according to their ethnicity when they were settled in cities, and they limited how much interaction they had with the Egyptian authorities, or they regulated that strictly, I should say. So yes, there were both laws, cultural attitudes, and sometimes often they were hostile, and sometimes they were not.
It's so fascinating, and it's also fascinating to, as you've demonstrated so nicely, the differences, for instance, just between Greece and Egypt, right? And so we can't sort of expect a one size fits all. There's so many cultural attitudes that are coming out, even in legal materials and that sort of thing. Okay, here's another question. Can you speak more about the example of Isis and her linked identity with other Mediterranean goddesses? Do we see this pan-Mediterranean link through iconography as well as textual references?
In what the Greek historians call the Hellenistic period, so this is from the 4th century BCE onward and into the Roman period, yes, there are artistic aesthetics that are common throughout the Mediterranean, and of Isis, but also of other Egyptian gods as well that we see worshipped in other places in the Mediterranean. One of the interesting things about Isis is that when we start to see on Delos, on the island of Delos, which in the period that I mentioned, 2nd century BC onward, was administered by the Romans, but the Romans had also given Athens the jurisdiction to basically carry all the administration out. So by this point in time, when we start to see these dedications to Isis Astarte, Isis had already been worshipped on Delos, but also in Athens and other places in the Greek world, even before the Ptolemies became the dynasty that ruled Egypt. So one of the things that made it, I think, easy for this type of new divinity to appear and be worshipped in the ways that Isis, Astarte, Aphrodite were. And, it didn't just happen with this goddess. We also have other examples of Apollo, Harpocrates, and other deities as well, but, I'm limited by time with what I could present. By the time that we see these lists of names attributed to a single deity, the Greeks living there had already been familiar with the worship of Isis as an Egyptian goddess, right? And then she became also very popular in the Ptolemaic period because she was purposefully, in some ways, the Ptolemies were setting up sanctuaries of Isis and Serapis and other gods as a way of declaring sort of kind of soft propaganda for their empire. So I don't know if that answers the whole question, but this is just something more than I can say about this particular equation identification. And also, yes, in terms of the artistic style, as we move forward in time, it seems to be more standardized and less Egyptian as Isis, in Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, Egypt.
Right. Thank you so much. Actually, there's a follow-up question related to religion, so I'll just read it out here. The narrative of migration shifts with political winds and economic realities. What has been the role of religious communities in attenuating or defining xenophobic attitudes?
Let's see. One of the things that we see happening in Greek societies, in ancient Greek societies, I guess I'm presuming also this question is referring to Antiquity, or at least that's how I'm going to read it. But one of the things that we see in Greek societies is the creation of professional Phoenician associations that are centered around a profession, but also a cult, a religious cult. That was usually the most prominent cult in their home state. So for instance, in Athens, we have a Kytian association from Kytion on Cyprus that is centered around, and they're Kytian traders, and it's centered around the worship of Aphrodite, Astarte. On Delos, we have examples of the Tyrians, who in Greek are called the Herakleistai. So the Heracles is the Greek hero who is equated with the Phoenician god Melkart, who was the patron deity of Tyre. We have the Beretians, who are called the Poseidoniastai. So Poseidon is a translation of the god Baal, was the most prominent deity in Berytos. So we have these professional associations, but they're also very clearly structured around religion. And perhaps, what's going on in Egypt with the Temple of Astarte, which is the center of the quarter of the Phoenicians living in Memphis, is maybe a similar kind of thing. And so in these cases of these professional associations that are both religious and professional, what we see is that they are able to mediate sometimes the interactions between the host state and the migrants. So for instance, we have examples of the Kytian traders, for instance, asked for the right to own property, because that was not a right that immigrants had, so that they could build a sanctuary dedicated to Astarte. Right. And then we actually have dedications from this sanctuary as well. And it seems that it wasn't just for the professional association, but we have women giving dedications there in Piraeus, in Athens. So clearly it benefited the community as a whole as well. We also see professional associations ask the state, the host state, to give other kinds of awards to individual members. So honoring individual Phoenicians who belong to that association because of services that they provided to, say, Athens. They sold grain to Athens at lower prices, or rescued Athenian hostages and brought them back to Athens, whatever it is that they may have done. So in this way, there is an aspect of a religious/professional association mediating the experience of the Phoenician immigrants in their host states.
Wow, thank you so much. So it's just fascinating. I think probably one final question, and this one is from YouTube. Would the wealthy people mostly mention 4 to 5 generations of ancestors? How did they remember all those ancestors?
I think we have pretty short memories these days, because, but this is also documented in a way that the way that orality works versus the way that we read, or so the way that we remember things has changed over time. And I think we have to imagine that in societies where oral transmission of history or culture, stories, I think that would have actually allowed them to perhaps remember their ancestors better than we might today. But there's also no guarantee that these genealogies that they are giving us are accurate. There's no way that we can check these. But I think the important point is that they think they are related, they think they are descended from these people, and they think they are descended from an ancestor who originally came from Tyre, in the case of the Carthaginian example that I gave.
Yeah, that's so there's no 23andMe that we can check. It's also just so fascinating. And I know from, just from anthropological work on living societies, that usually like 3 or 4 generations is about, what our human memories can seem to retain. Now, there are some where, of course, with the aid of writing or with the aid of oral poetry or whatever, at least claim that they can go back, who knows, 600 generations or something like that. But
And certainly, actually, if I can just jump in here for a moment, like, my grandmother, who lived to be almost 102, I would sit with her when she was 100, and she would tell me this, she would trace her genealogy and tell me about these cousins and uncles and stories, and I kept repeating them and repeating them. They've all disappeared from my brain, and I don't know who remembers them anymore. So, it's also just the loss of that knowledge that disappears with people.
So it's so fascinating, and also, right, those texts that you had that show that rootedness in a homeland, even after numerous generations. It's such a important thing for diaspora communities, even through multiple generations. Anyway, thank you so much. I don't want to take up more time. I think we can all just take a moment and thank Denise for her amazing research and such a great talk. And then I'll pass the floor off to Melissa.
Yeah, so I'm wanting to second the thanks and invite the YouTube audience to also warmly join us, or to join us in warmly thanking our speaker today, Professor Denise Demetriou. And we'd also like to invite everyone to our next talk in this lecture series, which will be held October 3rd at the same time, 9:30 a.m. Pacific, featuring Dr. Joseph A. Greene, who'll be sharing his talk titled Canaan's Seed, Ancient Near Eastern Folkways in the Western Mediterranean. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.